All right, welcome everybody to Tennis Channel Inside In on the Tennis Channel Podcast Network. Mitch Michals, as always, here in the Santa Monica studios. Great show this week. Joined now by my guest. First time on the program, very popular online, a big voice in social media in the tennis community. He co-hosts the Tennis and Bagels podcast. You've seen his stuff on Twitter at the forefront of some analytics and some data-driven analysis. Has written for several publications. Vansh Vermani, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that intro, Mitch. I feel all buttered up now and super excited to be on Tennis Channel Inside In. Huge fan of this podcast. And yeah, happy to talk about some action in Monte Carlo last week.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a second. I do want to ask you, though, because I like to hear the origin stories, players, analysts, everybody. I know your background a little bit. We've talked briefly. You were a pretty competitive tennis player yourself, but how did you really discover the game? I know when we talked, it doesn't really run in your family. You just kind of fell in love with it by chance, maybe by accident. How did your, love affair with the sport of tennis come to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a little bit more of a non-traditional way, I guess, how I started. I was just, bored one summer and just strolling around my neighborhood and not really that much to do when you're 7 or 8 years old. This was back in 2008. And I just came across a couple of Prince tennis rackets lying near the local dumpster. And so I just, at that age, I just sort of picked it up. I was like, okay, I'll just, we have some space in the garage. Yeah. And I thought I'll just, get some rhythm going against the wall and just kind of get some reps and start hitting. And I didn't really know the technique or anything like that. And this sort of coincided almost at the exact same weekend as the 2008 Wimbledon final between Nadal and Federer. And it just so happens, obviously, extremely lucky that it was one of the greatest matches of all time, still remembered and talked about forever in the history books. And from then on, I sort of just picked up a knack for playing and started training and getting more competitive. And then slowly I sort of veered a lot more into watching, I think. Watching and observing and analyzing different patterns in the game closely and just kind of, and then I sort of started writing, and then the online work came at a much later stage. I'd say right when the pandemic hit, that's sort of when I picked up sort of going online and, building a whole tennis community out of it. So I've been really fortunate to meet so many great people through that. And yeah, the journey continues lifelong.
Yeah, I guess there's weirder or worse things to pick up when you're bored. So tennis being one of the better ones, one of the better hobbies. But that's a cool story. And I know you're modest about your career. You played at a pretty high level. And then, like all of us, when we pick a sport out, unless for a select few that go pro, there is that end of the line. My follow-up to that would just be, what was it about how you were interpreting the game in the last couple of years, how you're analyzing things? What was it that you thought was maybe missing in the analysis, or something that you could add in terms of how you view a match and how you could break stuff down in a different way through data and analysis?
Yeah, I think it's it just sort of comes through watching from a different lens. I think, when you're growing up and you're a kid, you're sort of attracted to a few personalities in the game, and sort of the more dominant personalities, because they're the ones winning most of the Masters 1000s, most of the slams. We lived in a golden era with the big three, with Serena Williams, with Andy Murray, with players like that who just week upon week, they had that insane consistency. Mm-hmm. So it just, once you started seeing some new figures come into the game, and you started seeing, especially the last 2 or 3 years, a lot more depth varied across both tours, and a lot more, some uncertainty, mixture of different results. That's when you, being the sort of hard-grained big three fan that I started to sort of expand and go beyond a few subset of players and really just analyze the tour as a whole, and just talk a lot more about the landscape, about how, different things in the game are changing, maybe, a few more trends, a few more, and then you just start sort of observing some different weird statistical anomalies, and maybe some stats that maybe aren't mentioned quite so frequently on TV, but if you start drawing some parallels, or maybe you just remember who played who in the draw, and you just sort of keep track of results that way, I think it's not so much of a surprise when you see a certain player break through, right, for instance.
Right. I think a lot of us that don't have the pro level experience want to know why certain things happen. And as you said, 100% true. The big three, they kind of dominated the field with Andy Murray as a big four, but then you get this new era where it's, at least right now, we've got some new faces that are coming up, but we're going to see who steps out. And there's a good way to use data to maybe study and kind of make some educated predictions as to who's going to do just that. Going to the past weekend, the first Masters clay event of the 2023 season on the men's side. Andrey Rublev gets his first Masters 1000 title. He's been known, justifiably so, as the king of the 500 level. Made the final of this event 2 years ago where he lost to Tsitsipas. He did it. He gets to the top of this tournament. And Vanch, he did it the hard way. I mean, his path to get there was not easy. Had a lot of battles. Taylor Fritz and then Holger Rune. Some great matches, some high drama, high level of tension, to say the least. But how is he able to, looking at the Fritz match and then looking at the Holger match, conquer this tournament, those opponents, when there were times in both matches you could clearly see he wasn't playing his big tennis? How did he flip the switch, not playing his best, to get the job done, hoist the trophy?
Yeah, I mean, what you said is absolutely spot on. They were not easy matches at all. I mean, he was down a set in his first round against Jaime Munar as well. And then once he sort of climbed his way through the path into the semis, I think that's when it became, his mental fortitude was really put to the test. And, normally you don't associate poise and patience and calmness and things like nerve management and steadiness with a guy like Andrey Rublev. We know how, things in his personality that make him super endearing.
Yeah.
He's super emotional as a character, but oftentimes we've seen sometimes in matches, particularly the last couple of years in these big stages where he has a little bit of a mental block, I think. And, particularly whether it be the 0-for-7 record in major quarterfinals or having been to a couple of Masters 1000 before. He just broke through last year and made the semifinals of Turin, which he hadn't done before. This is a guy who's been a top 10 player for, the better part of the last 3 years. It's been impressive because his floor is so high.
Yeah.
But now the question is, how did he take that into the next? How did he manage his nerves in the biggest moments?
Right.
Particularly the third set against Taylor Fritz. And I think having played Fritz very tight and having lost to him in the last 3 times they played at Masters 1000 level, this time he felt like the conditions were more in his favor. Obviously, you had the rain delay. You had you had Fritz sort of playing extremely unsure about his shot making, particularly in the third set. I felt like he was pulling the trigger a bit too early on certain shots.
Yeah.
Whereas in the first set, Fritz kind of stole it with his defense, and for him playing on clay, getting this far, it was a huge step. But Rublev was really able to, I think, impose himself backhand to backhand as well.
That's a big point. I mean, I sorry to cut you off there, but I think the backhand to backhand is not something you'd associate with. He's put the work in to improve what we'd call deficiencies of his game. Serve's gotten a little better, still not the quite elite level, but that's improved backhand to backhand. It's poetic for me because he wins the match against Holger. I thought from the outside what changed when I noticed the change in maybe Rublev's ability to rein it in was the Australian Open this year. He's playing Holger there. He blows a chance basically to serve for it, goes up against match points down, all this stuff happens. The old Rublev might have just gone away, might have just started screaming and lost some stuff. He's really, he's still a young guy, 25, 26 years old. He's still harnessing things. And I think he's shown a lot of mental growth the last couple of years, which might have been the difference. He's a fighter. I know that runs in his family with his dad having a boxing background, but he is somebody that continually fights. We might not be able to say that about every player on tour, but he's locking himself in more. And I think that was such a huge win in Australia that it kept going here. And in these close matchups where there's rain delays, where there's wind, where there's stuff going on across the net with his opponent, he was just locked in and mentally sound.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it starts in the third set against Rune when he's down 1-4, 30-40. And, normally he can be quite predictable with his serve locations, and his second serve in particular is not known for being one of the fastest on the tour. He has the slowest average miles per hour speed and generally always goes to the backhand. But on that occasion, he went down the tee. He surprised Rune a little bit. Rune was not able to back up in time and get enough depth on his forehand to then come back to neutral and then have a chance in the rally. And once he sort of held in that game, Rune was struggling quite a bit physically, but he absolutely capitalized. I thought his backhand really took over the last 5 or 6 games of that match. He was really not only using it as a shield defensively, but he was actually doing some damage with it and sort of locking Rune in that backhand corner and forcing him to pull the trigger on certain shots that he might not always feel as comfortable going off of, especially if he had his legs underneath him. And I think Rublev really sensed that. He recognized it. And the second serve, I mean, he won 52% of his second serve points. And anytime you're above 50% and you're Andrey Rublev, you absolutely take that because particularly on clay. And I think there's something to be said for his, because his game style, because he maybe doesn't have, let's say, the repertoire of an Alcaraz or a Tsitsipas or players like that, or even a Lorenzo Musetti, players who play with a lot more variation and variety and mixing spins up, what he does have is a solid, reliable game plan under
Yeah.
pressure, because you kind of know what's coming. But also he's so good at that high margin aggression game style where he's sort of hitting inside in, inside out backhands and forehands, in the ad corner, and he just doesn't really give away. I think he doesn't really give up in those moments. He's very underrated, I think, as a competitor. That's inner self-belief and
Yeah.
steeliness is always there, even if you might not see it, because he's not always the most confident guy. He actually, yeah.
Even if he doesn't have like,
Yeah.
would you say it's like as many tools in his tool bag? Is that?
Yeah, to quote Stefanos
Yeah.
Tsitsipas.
I got to give props to Tsitsipas today. He did say that he shouldn't have said that. He gave Rublev props and said, which I've always been on the side of, players are heated after losses. They're going to say stuff they don't mean. I'm glad Tsitsipas was able to, acknowledge that he was a little out of his mind in that moment and move on there.
Absolutely. And the rest of the tour is, such great friends with him. It's so great to see that outpouring of emotion just from everyone in social media, because they know how hard he's worked for this moment. I mean, this was his 40th Masters 1000 played, and he's really put in the hard yards. And of course, he's super endearing, and I just love his post-match interviews afterwards, where he's just super honest and just tells it how it is.
He's the best. Again, props to him and putting himself in the mix as a factor in the clay court season leading up to the Road to Roland Garros. I want to talk to you, Vansh, now about Holger Rune. A lot to discuss about this guy, and we'll start with the positives, right? There's something dynamic about this kid, his game, his personality, his flair. He's becoming one of the most watched guys must-watch guys in men's tennis. And I think a lot of that has to do, first and foremost, with the game. Say what you want. We will hear in a second about some of the other stuff, but the game is there. The strides he's made from number 79 in the world to now up to number 7. He's got a beautiful, beautiful forehand. He pummels returns or serves that aren't in the wheelhouse where they should be. And he can finish at the net very, very beautifully. I think we got to start there. Give credit where credit's due. There's a lot of good personalities in tennis, but very few have the level of skill that this guy has.
You hit the nail on the head, absolutely, with your last point. He really backs up what he's saying and he backs up his on-court demeanor with a serious elite game. He has that sort of unquantifiable X factor. The arm is extremely explosive, lively, but I love the intelligence that he also has in his game. Amidst the massive forehands and the aggressive second serve returns, he has, such good deft touch on his backhand drop shot as well, and he can hit beautiful open stance backhands on the dead run. His forehand, I like the variation that he has on his forehand, because he can also hit super difficult, pacey, sort of on the run forehands where he injects loads of pace. But he can also, just on a clay court, he can buy himself a little bit of that extra time and loop it up high and get it to the opponent's backhand, and then just sort of dictate from there. I think, as long as he just, with some more maturity, when he just learns to relax a little bit and stay a little bit calmer and not get so uptight. I think I was on a podcast with Steve Flink, and he sort of described him as like highly strung, and
that's a good way.
He's sort of like a fireball of energy, like just very ambitious, extremely energetic, and at times can be a little bit brash or just sort of unaware of how he's coming across. But I think props to him, because he's unafraid to be his authentic self, and that kind of energy, it really helped him in that match, particularly against Sinner in the last 2 sets, where he was able to feed off of that crowd support that he was getting.
Yeah, he's not afraid of anybody, and I love that about him. And I think the maturity will happen. He's still super young. There's moments, going against the crowd when he's getting booed. Okay, like I get that. Some of the stuff with the opposing players, and I think that will come. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think he is his authentic self. My critique right now, and this is nitpicking to a point, there are times when I don't feel like he's in the fight enough, where he's not only getting broken or losing or losing a return game, but it's at love. It's, air mailing shots like into the wall, and that might've been the difference with Rublev, is that even when he was down in that match, there was still a battling. And again, this could come with more experience and more chances to be a professional tennis player. But that's the part of his game where I think maybe it's a physical issue of getting in a little bit better elite shape, but there were times when he would lose these games going away. And I think that's the stuff to stay in the fight more that'll make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw it a little bit already in Australia when these two played, and he had many leads in that 5th set. Obviously, a couple of match points, 5-2, led I think 7-2 and 5-0 in the tiebreak as well. But he just, to your point, I think he just gets a little bit too eager and ambitious in certain moments, and then there's other times where I think his physical durability is still just a little bit of a concern, because that sort of leads into his shot selection, and he sort of goes for broke on certain shots, and and it's kind of spirals out of control. And I think that spiraling will just sort of sort of has to learn to pace himself with and sort of take his time in between points. It was very strange because at 4-1 he sort of asked for the salts and asked for the trainer, and when he was serving at 4-2, this wasn't, you could tell from his body language, this wasn't a guy who was leading in the scoreboard, as if you had just turned on the TV for the first time. So I think there's still some work to do sort of in that, like backing up those big wins, in a best of 5 setting. I think that's where the concern would lie for me just yet, because I think the game is there, the talent is there, and the full repertoire is there, but now it's just a matter of honing in these finer details with the physical durability and shot selection.
When you look at the other semifinals, Vansh, I mean, you're looking at Sinner and Fritz, who I know it didn't go their way. They had matches they felt like they could win and they didn't win. I don't want to be Mr. Motivational Speaker here, but this is a good step for both of these players. It's also the first step on a very long clay court season. So I think it's a tough loss. Anytime you lose, it's going to leave a bad taste in your mouth. But for each of them, Sinner right there showing his brilliance on clay, and Fritz just progressively getting better and more professional, and being a legit clay court player now too, all-purpose player. I think there's going to be a lot of positives these two young players take away.
Yeah, absolutely. For Jannik Sinner, I mean, he's made now the semifinals of Indian Wells, Miami, and Monte Carlo, became the youngest player ever to do that in the Open era. And the only other players to really do that in the single season are the Big Four. So I think, and he's put himself right up there in the top 5. He's constantly improving. I love the tinkering that he's done on his serve, particularly the last couple of years. He's becoming more explosive and dynamic, and sort of working on, adding some more variation to his game. And the serve is getting as much better than it used to be a couple of years ago. So I'm still very encouraged and bullish by him. He's losing a little bit too many of these close matches right now, but I think with time, he's absolutely going to flip the script. We already saw how close he was last year, and I think it's just a matter of time for Sinner. It wouldn't shock me if he picked up a Masters 1000 win this year, or made the semifinals of a major, as those are clearly the next steps.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Sinner is one of the guys to keep an eye on. Before we wrap up the Monte Carlo discussion and look ahead to what's happening, I want to get your take on the Medvedev-Zverev situation. Lots been said, a lot happened. There's too much to break down. But I think the long and short of it, I mean, there's 2 parts of this for me. One being, I don't understand Zverev still going over a bathroom break that was inconsequential to the match. That's number one, smaller term picture. Number 2 being, I think it is kind of good to have people that aren't friends playing high level tennis. So I'm taking myself out of it, and just whatever the true story is, it's just kind of nice that not everyone's best friends out there. How do you break down what we saw in, this budding rivalry now, 8-6 Medvedev head to head in that one, but with what went down between Medvedev and Zverev?
Yeah, it was a very sort of spicy affair that both, incidents took place on the court as well as in the press room. But, on the court, Zverev cited that he was unhappy about Medvedev sort of his behavior, like breaking the stick on the net court and then taking a bathroom break in the third set, which, I mean, was in under 90 seconds, and he was back very quickly. And the strange part about that is that, he held serve very easily the next game and then broke. So it's not as if his momentum was completely disrupted. And I think, Medvedev obviously had his brilliant comebacks in the press room afterwards, and said, it sort of compared his comments to some of the other peers, and Karen and Diego and Rublev and players like that. And he sort of said, you need to look at yourself in the mirror, and some really nice sort of some really nice ways of going about it, because he also acknowledged that in the heat of moment you can say certain things that right after the loss, but then he just sort of step by step took the aggro and broke it down. And if you're gonna hit Medvedev with these sort of things, you better be really good, because he's excellent at playing this kind of playing this type of role, because he's just so articulate.
Yeah, and these are 2 players who I'm actually curious about their individual clay court seasons coming up. Medvedev says he doesn't like it, kind of downplays him stuff. I think it's a tactic. I've been on the record saying that. I think he's much better than he gives himself credit for on the clay, and he's shown that. Zverev was a bona fide top 3 or 4 clay court player in the world. the health, the confidence that comes with that. Is he getting back to normal? It seems like he's getting there. So we'll see if both those players get there. And then one other player to just monitor what they're doing. Vansh, where are you at with Stefanos Tsitsipas? Has had some struggles, is open about the shoulder, taking time to get there. French Open finalist a year or 2 years ago, rather, getting to that mountaintop. But where are we at with Tsitsipas, his health, and him as a contender in the clay season?
Yeah, so I mean, for Stefanos, it was I don't think he had the best sort of rhythm in Monte Carlo because his first round was cut a bit short, and then Nicholas Yari, he didn't get the whole sort of baseline rhythm that he would have wanted. And I thought Fritz played an absolutely fantastic match to beat him in the quarters, both tactically, and I think took advantage of with the backhand still not being sort of up to par on the clay yet, not having those reps. Played very few matches since Australia. Of course, we know what happened with the Sunshine Swing as well. But I think this week is going to be very key for Stefanos in Barcelona. Obviously, he's been to the final here twice. He loves playing here, and he's had success in all those big clay court events. So I expect him to sort of build form as the weeks go on, and I still expect him to be a number 4 or number 5 contender at Roland Garros, health permitting, which I think he seems to be more or less pain-free now. So I think that's the positive that you take away if you're Tsitsipas. And for Zverev, obviously, he's still somewhat early in his comeback, but he showed a lot of great signs in Dubai and Indian Wells, and he seems to really be at 90 to 95% of his physical game, I would say. It's just a question of, can he get the big wins, and can he close in on these big matches, particularly these 2 matches against Medvedev, where he had loads of opportunities. But clearly we know last year he was, pushing Rafa to the brink and playing some of his best tennis, obviously beating Carlos and at the French. So I certainly expect like Madrid to be a really good place for Zverev, because he's won the title there twice and made the finals, and those conditions with the altitude.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to give credit to the other side of the net in Tsitsipas's case. And that's a good point in terms of match play. Sometimes you don't want that retirement, right? When it's the bigger goal in mind, you want to get those reps out there. Yeah. More with Vansh Vermani here on Tennis Channel Insight In. Well, looking at Novak Djokovic, because he was a player that made his return after not playing in the Sunshine Double, loses to Musetti early, has the sleeve on his arm. There's the issues there. His serve numbers were a little down. On one hand, anytime someone is protecting an arm like that, it is cause for concern. On the other hand, we know what the end goal is here. We know Djokovic is kind of rounded into form, would be a way to put it, with Monte Carlo being his least successful clay event. Anything at all, in your opinion, Vanch, that we should be concerned about as he goes into the home tournament in Serbia and then tries to win another Roland Garros?
I think my concern would just be, how does the elbow hold up? Just because it was a little surprising to see the compression sleeve, particularly after his first round, where I thought he played much better in the second set. And you thought, okay, now maybe the rust is slowly starting to get behind him. And he was up a set in 4-2 against Musetti. Obviously, Musetti is certainly a player who can, trouble Djokovic, asks a lot of questions of his finishing power, particularly on his forehand. And we saw his serve. He was broken 8 times and some double faults, and just shaking off a lot of that rust because he hasn't played in 5 or 6 weeks. But I expect him to get some more matches in this week, and then we'll see about Madrid. I think that's going to be something to monitor as well, as does he play Madrid and Rome, because traditionally Rome and Roland Garros is where he really starts to peak and get his game to the next level. Like we saw last year, it started with a match against Alcaraz in Madrid, but then he won Rome, and then it was really only Nadal in a tight 4-setter who stopped him at Roland Garros. So
I love that I love that Djokovic gave Musetti credit, didn't use the injury as an excuse. And, whether or not that was something to monitor, which I think we will. You're right. Rome is where it turns into form and then into Roland Garros. He is a lot like Rafa in that regard, a well-oiled machine that needs time to kind of rev up and get to his peak performance. So I guess we'll see in Serbia, the home tournament at his tennis foundation, what that's going to look like. That field itself. And, looking at the kind of Serbia field, we were 1 match away from Stan and Djokovic there. Instead, Stan bows out. But I'm not necessarily looking forward to or looking at the results of who Djokovic plays or how he does there. But there's actually some game players in this field with Coric, with Rublev. So he could get some pretty big match play in his home event.
Yeah, absolutely. And last year we saw a final between Rublev and Djokovic, and that really and this wasn't an easy event for him last year. And it's a similar sort of field again, with a lot of Serbian players and Coric and Rublev, and they all really sort of pushed Djokovic last year, but it was a great way for him to get those match reps and rhythm in, and just sort of play long matches and just work out the physical issues that he's having, and maybe just feel a lot better about his game because, yeah, like
was it
I
2
think,
years ago that he played the Russian Karatsev in Serbia? That was
yes.
after he won the French Open too. So that was like the best thing that happened to him. Just play a 3-hour match and get a
Yeah,
lot of
absolutely.
experience.
It was totally perfect because
Yeah.
yeah, just another data point, I guess, when
Yeah.
you're a top player like this and so he's just sort of calibrating, and he's looking to be at peak absolute physical fitness, because we know the main one that matters is
Yeah.
fitness.
So I want to ask you this question. We brought up a lot of names. We haven't talked about Alcaraz. We haven't talked about Casper Ruud, last year's clay court finalist. You mentioned before about what the levels are. So if we were going to go like your top 5, doesn't even have to necessarily be in order, but who are the contenders? What's the pecking order look like for Roland Garros contenders? And there could even be groups and levels to it. But I know Rafa's a wild card too, based on his health. But what's it look like to you at this moment? Subject to change, of course, going into RG 2023.
Yeah, it's a very tricky one because it doesn't seem like Carlos and Novak are really ever in the same draw, and those would be my two sort of leading contenders. Rafa not permitting. Obviously, if Rafa's back healthy in the field, he's number one for me until anything else happens otherwise. But right now, I'd probably say Carlos, because I'm maybe the most sure that at this moment, watching his match today in Barcelona, and the question for him is just, can he be healthy enough to play with the nagging injuries and those start-stop things? Can he be healthy enough to play Barcelona, Madrid, Rome, and
100%.
So, but because of that, I still maybe have him as number one if I was to do a power ranking right now. You obviously have to respect Djokovic's incredible success and having won the title twice, and his pedigree. But at the moment, I might have him number 2 just because of the concern with the elbow.
Yeah, I can't go that far just yet. And I love Carlos and everything that he does. There's only, today he won in 62 minutes or something like that. And he's won this tournament before, beat Tsitsipas pretty cleanly. There's 2 things to break down why I have it this way. One being that Djokovic, best of 5, still going to trust him until I see somebody beat him other than Nadal, obviously, on the clay. The other thing is the point you brought up. Like, I want to know how, and maybe this is another question, how can Alcaraz stay healthy for this long run? Because we know in any one match, any one tournament, he's got the goods to just dazzle, win, dismantle the field. When that forehand's going timed with the grunt, it's like a bomb being dropped. It's like a sledgehammer going off. But I do think though that maybe there's ways, and maybe you can comment on this too, that he can kind of, tighten things up in terms of staying healthy and peaking like Djokovic and Nadal have done, and Federer before them at majors. How can Alcaraz stay fresh enough to not have another injury break, which he's had a couple of times recently?
Yeah, obviously he has a very explosive game, and you don't want to take away the never say die hard attitude and the point-by-point mentality, which he clearly goes about it, because every single shot he's going to want to track down, whether it be impossible shots that no human on the planet, not even Alcaraz, has a chance of getting there, but he's going to absolutely try. And so that's the thing that I would just maybe caution him to just let a few points go. And, maybe when you're up 40 love or you're down the 40, and, you want to be a little bit mindful in that moment of maybe not overdoing a split step, or like when he hurt his hand, diving for a return basically on the ad side against Sinner, stuff like that. It's in the minute moments where you can't really, you have a split second, and it's all about quick reaction time. And that's where I would just caution Alcaraz to play it a little bit on the safe side. But at the same time, you don't want to mess with the whole psychology of what has gotten him so far, because if you start doing that, then that could have maybe some other longer term implications. But it's a good point you bring up, especially about the injuries.
Maybe it's get to the net a little more, try to play some shorter points and just work on that. And, it's
rely a little bit more on his serve as well, because we know at the US Open, he really beefed up his serve, particularly in the 4th set. And that was one of the best serving sets I've ever seen from Alcaraz. It's going to be a little bit, maybe a little harder to do that on the clay, but I think having won Madrid and the altitude and such a great kick serve that he has ways of winning short points as well, which is nice.
Depending how Barcelona and Madrid go, which should be very long, we'll see if he plays Rome. That's the other thing. Is that going to be the event where he takes a refresher like Iga Swiatek did last year, to kind of take a break and then win the French Open? So something to see there. Before we wrap this up, I do want to get your thoughts, Vansh, on Casper Ruud's win over Ben Shelton today. Ben Shelton into the top 40 Casper Ruud wins in straight sets. First set was 6-1. Second set, a 7-6 tiebreaker finish where Ben Shelton actually broke back when Ruud was serving for the match. But on the one hand, for Ben Shelton, this is a kid where I'm starting to see what the hype is about on clay specifically. His game does really translate. With that being said, still very raw, still a lot of stuff to work on at the elite level. Some things to be coached up on, but I'm starting to see, as I'm sure you are, why his game translates on the clay, because he can do a lot of good things out there that very few can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw it in some of the matches he played, even though he lost to Dominic Thiem in Estoril, the match before that and the match today as well. He has an amazing kick serve. The serve is an absolute joke. I mean, you ask certain college players who played against him, and the way he's able to get the ball way out of the opponent's strike zone, both with height, but also with his incredible placement on both the deuce side and the ad side. And then he has such really nice deft touch and hands at the net as well to complement it. And he's starting to learn a little bit of the intricacies of sliding and changing direction. And that's been sort of fun to watch him observe. Yeah. I almost don't even care at all about his results this clay court season because he's just so new on the block. But it's just so nice to see his game against the very best, because you see the weapons that he has, and you see why he got to 40 in the world. And that Australian Open is more than enough for this year for him to be not too concerned about his.
Yeah, he can run around and get to that forehand, and it's pretty beautiful to watch. And the kick serve, you're right. I watched, I think it was John Isner, who said his favorite court to serve on is one of the outer courts. I think Madrid. It was one of the clay court events. And it cuts people by surprise. He's like, if I can kick it high, there's not a lot of room there on the dirt. It's going to be very tough to return. So I'm with you there. Ben Shelton, it's a process. It's still ongoing. Very fun to watch. For Casper Ruud, who, by the way, was probably circling this one to get him back for the start of the Shelton Rise last year in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
He gets the job done. And much has been said, and he even said it himself, Vansh, with how he would have handled the offseason differently. Still just 20th in the race, working his way up as the number 4 player to the ATP finals again. But you watch him on clay, and you know that's exactly what the doctor ordered. It's a perfect medicine for him to get back on track. How he plays, how his game is suited for the clay is still very beautiful. And it's another thing where I don't think we're talking about tiers of players. Casper Ruud is a bona fide top 5 clay court player. Might not be the prettiest, flashiest game, but his game fits this surface so well.
Yeah, his game is tailor-made for this surface, obviously, with the super heavy forehand that he has, that he can just boss around and dictate points with, and with the deep return position. But he's also proven that he can make some adjustments as well in his game and mix up the return position, maybe block a few more returns, he also moves better on clay, and slides and change directions better. And I thought the win in Estoril was still pretty big on him. Obviously, the knock on him is always, playing these clay 250s and winning so many of them. But I actually think that was really, really good for his confidence to pick up 4 match wins like that in a row and just sort of get back in the groove of things. And if this week goes well for him, I could definitely see him making a push in Rome and still be at the be in the final weekend of Paris, depending on how the draw shakes out. So he's absolutely still in my top 6 or 7 contenders, let's say.
So yeah, let's just put a button on that. If it's Djokovic, Alcaraz with Nadal is like that, enigma floating around. Yeah. What's the very next tier like, and how many people are on it after those 3 names?
Yeah, so for me, it probably goes Tsitsipas and Ruud.
On the same level.
Tsitsipas and Zverev and Ruud and Sinner. That would be sort of my next tier.
Those guys. And it's and okay, so I guess you're saying that they could still separate themselves in the next couple of weeks, but right now, yeah, I think that's fair. But I will say Tsitsipas will be the one I need to see it more quicker, because we just haven't seen the high level. I would say Holger's though right there, because Holger's going to be.
Yes, Holger absolutely as well. I still think I think clay is Holger's best surface, actually, because that's the one where he's had the most success. Obviously, the Munich title and Roland Garros quarterfinals last year, and now he's got really, really big wins on the surface too. And the game absolutely translates. I have a few reservations, perhaps, about the best of 5 and the physical durability, but that's separate from his skills. Absolutely.
Do you see this becoming very top heavy in Barcelona with Alcaraz, with Ruud, with Tsitsipas? Do you think we're going to be looking at, I don't want to say all chalk, but probably one of those 3 or one of the big contenders going all the way and holding the trophy at the end of it?
Yeah, I think it would surprise me if someone other than those names actually ended up winning winning the trophy at the end. Certainly with Carlos, I'm excited to see perhaps him against potentially Davidovich Fokina. I think that could be a really fascinating clash, with Fokina excelling on clay in the past, and he sort of has the explosiveness and amazing flair in his game that can actually maybe cause some problems for some top players. So I'm interested in that. And I personally hope we get to see some of these big names in the final weekend. But I'm also looking at a guy like Cam Norrie. He's super tough as nails.
Yeah.
On the clay, and even players like Sinner and Schwartzman. That should be a fun match to watch tomorrow, I guess. And potentially if we get another Sinner versus Alcaraz match at the end of the weekend, no one would complain about that, right?
No, they wouldn't. They definitely wouldn't. And we see this time of year, especially at the heights of any level of tennis, but it's how you process these losses and move forward, because there is only one winner. We saw Francis Tiafoe lose to Rusevori. I bring that up because it wasn't Tiafoe's best match down the stretch. New uncharted territory for him as a new top guy, knocking on the door of the top 10. It's going to be how you handle these losses and how you get ready. So, whether it's Tiafoe going forward into next week, or, Tsitsipas coming off of injuries, Alexander Zverev playing in his home tournament in Germany, there's opportunities here to build some momentum, but we know how process oriented everything is. So all roads lead to Roland Garros, but this week is very, very tricky on the tennis calendar.
Yeah, completely. And of course, we haven't even mentioned Taylor Fritz, who obviously, incredible run in Monte Carlo, but he's really acclimated himself to, improving continually on the dirt. And, I was very bullish at the start of Monte Carlo that he could be in the final weekend. And I think I even predicted him into my final, just because I like the extra time the clay gives him.
Yeah.
And we know how much better he is now with his athleticism and his movement, especially in the corners. Credit to Mike Russell and all the great coaches that he has in his team, but it really feels like he's that power that he has, especially on his forehand, which has improved quite a bit in the last 2 years, and obviously with the serve and his just how smart he is tactically, and making mid-match adjustments, and how clutch he's been this year, week in and week out as a competitor, 13-2 in tie breaks, and a lot of different stats that really point to, I think, Fritz being a top 10 player on this surface as well. So if we were doing tiers, I might have him sort of as right at the top of tier 3, let's say.
I have to put Rublev somewhere in there. I mean, he did just win the tournament. We got to end it with that. Rublev's got to be, in the mix too. So there's no shortage of contenders, which is so great this time of year. We've got some new faces emerging. It's really great.
And of course, there's the storyline of Dominic Thiem as well this week, and potential Thiem versus Fritz clash, which would be fascinating for both guys to know where they're at.
It really would. Well, Vansh Vermani, this has been a blast. I'll end with this because I want to give you time here to defend, or maybe not defend, but just go off on the topic of clay Hawkeye technology, where we are with that, and what you think the underlying issues are, and what you would do to kind of remedy the situation, if anything.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I have seen, Fox 10, for example, being used in certain tournaments throughout the Golden Swing, and also in Estoril, and that seemed to be pretty effective. And I think the players were really kind of on board with it, and there weren't really too many differences between maybe the mark that they see on the actual clay when the umpire comes down and what the video replay is showing. So it would be really nice to have a sort of reliable technology that, the players can sort of get on board with. I think Hawkeye right now leaves a little bit too much to be desired in terms of the margin of error might be too big at this point. So maybe it wouldn't, because the mark that's being shown a lot of times on TV, used by Tennis Channel or other broadcasters, they show the Hawkeye, but it's not actually available for the umpires on the court. So you're pointing to one mark, but then it's a little misleading for the viewer, because they're not always in line. So I think if we could sort that out, that would be the best way. But so I'm kind of with you in a sense, but I can also see why it's not being used, because it's not fully trusted yet.
In the grand scheme of things, these are very, very few instances where we're having this discussion. So it's more than likely not going to cost anyone an individual match, but something to consider based on where we are technologically speaking. So just want to get your thoughts on that. Vansh Vermani, really appreciate you coming on the show. Big fan of yours on Twitter and your Tennis and Bagels podcast as well. We'll make sure to follow you for all your info. What's the Twitter handle? And then what do you got going on in the future?
Yeah, so my Twitter is at VanchV2K, 2 and the letter K, like 2000 basically. And then, you can also check out Talking Tennis, which is a YouTube channel. And I do some commentary for them and some post-match, pre-match analysis as well. So they've got some good content over there where usually I'm pretty heavily featured in the next coming weeks, especially during the clay season. So that's kind of mostly what I have going. And then of course, check out the podcast at Tennis and Bagels as well. And and I appreciate you so much Mitch for having me. It was an absolute blast, really enjoyable discussion, and love all the amazing guests that you bring on to the show.
Appreciate that a ton. We'll have to have you back on. Best of luck with everything, and enjoy the clay court season as much as I am. Vansh Vermani, thanks for coming on Tennis Channel Insight In.
Thanks, really enjoyed it.